So today we're gonna be presenting case 12. Next slide, please. So for the identifying data, the patient is a 60-year-old male, right-handed, retired from Mandaluyong City, brought to the institution for the second time. The chief complaint is sudden onset severe headache, right-sided weakness, and altered mental status. Next slide, please. For the history of present illness, approximately 4 hours ago, the patient was at home when he experienced a sudden severe headache associated with nausea and vomiting. Shortly thereafter, he noticed weakness in his right arm and leg. His family brought him to the emergency department immediately. There is no history of seizures, loss of consciousness, or previous similar episodes. The pertinent positives of the case are sudden severe headache, nausea, vomiting, right-sided weakness, and altered mental status. The pertinent negatives are seizures and loss of consciousness. Next slide, please. So here is our temporal profile. Next slide, please.
So for the past medical history, hypertension for 18 years and losartan 100 milligram tablet once a day taken after breakfast with poor compliance. Dyslipidemia for 12 years and simvastatin 20 milligram per tablet once a day taken after supper with also with poor compliance. No history of diabetes mellitus type 2, no food or drug allergies. Transient ischemic attack on March 2021 and was discharged improved after 3 days. So for the past medical history, what's missing is probably the patient's usual BP readings. So this is important since knowing the prior readings can help us see whether the stroke was triggered by an acute spike in the blood pressure, like if my recent stressful event ba, um, or the stroke developed on top of chronic poorly controlled hypertension. Knowing also the BP
Uh,
can also guide us management, and also maybe we can clarify in compliance ng patient. How often does he miss the medications and why? We can also ask if there's any recent over-the-counter medications such as decongestants or NSAIDs that can also increase the blood pressure. Next slide, please. Next slide. For the family history, hypertension and diabetes mellitus type 2 on both sides of the family. That's secondary to myocardial infarction on his father's side. No known history of stroke. For the social history, the patient is an active smoker for computed 23 pack. He is an occasional alcoholic beverage drinker at an average of one session per week and prefers to drink beer. He denies history of illicit drug use. He is right-handed and graduated college with a degree in architecture. He is a retired architect and used to manage his own architectural firm. For the social history, maybe we can also ask him sa caffeine and energy drinks intake. Since similar to being, this can also quickly raise the BP by stimulating the sympathetic nervous system. So this can also increase the heart rate and the blood pressure. For the beer, since it was also mentioned that the patient is an alcoholic beverage drinker, maybe we can also ask how many bottles per session so that we can know if yung severity and yung pattern of alcohol intake, and also does he smoke while drinking since yung nga 23 pack year smoker siya. So we can also add yung sa diet and sa salt intake since high fat or cholesterol can also contribute to dyslipidemia niya, and yung high salt intake can also increase the water retention and blood pressure. Lastly, yung sa exercise habits, we can add then yung exercise, we can also ask the patient since if sedentary lifestyle ba or may reason ba na strenuous excretion like yung exercises like heavy weightlifting or kaya naman isometric exercises like prolonged planks or kaya wall sits. For the review of systems, the pertinent positives is a cardiovascular hypertension is poorly controlled. For the nervous system, sudden onset, severe headache, right-sided weakness, and altered mental status. So this will be further discussed later. So pertinent positives and negatives. Next slide, please.
Hello, sorry, before we go to the physical examination, I would like to point out lang muna or I would like to make some comments regarding the temporal profile. Can you go back to that slide, please? Yeah. So here in this slide, for the temporal profile, the description of the headache was supposedly sudden severe, right? And likewise, upon appearance of the headache, the patient also experienced right-sided weakness. However, I don't think the sensorium was here because in the review of system, I think there was mention of decrease in sensorium also. So in this temporal profile, uh, a curving a curving progressive line, or a line that is increasing or going up and then curving isn't really a description or does not fit the description of a sudden severe headache. So we have to take note that a sudden severe headache, as the term implies, happens suddenly within a few seconds, or it progresses from zero to a severe intensity in a matter of seconds, or even there and then, or even just doesn't even take a second. So yung ng lining nyo dapat when you're talking about a sudden severe headache should be straight up, no? So let's say 4 days, or around, let's say, 3.5 hours prior, something like that. From zero, you would have a straight line going up, and then up to the severity of the headache. So hindi siya pwedeng curve. Kasi ang itsura nito, if we're going to look at this graph and take it for the story of the patient, at 4 hours prior, the patient has minimal headache. At 3 hours prior, the intensity of the headache increased to around 3 to 4. At 2 hours prior, the intensity of the headache is at around 6 to 8. And then at 1 hour, there would be around a 10/10 intensity or severity of the headache. So this is what it would show us. Also, when for the right-sided weakness, at 4 hours prior, the patient would have minimal right-sided weakness, increasing in the severity as the hours progresses. However, if you're going to look at your history, I think you would see that there is instantaneous or really sudden loss in the motor function, or in the strength of the patient. No? And then supposedly, if there is a decrease in sensorium, you would also put in a legend or a graph or a line with regards to the sensorium. Now, and vomiting, what this would tell me is that at 4 hours, there was minimal vomiting and it did not stop. At 3 hours, the patient vomited more without stopping from 4 hours. At 2 hours, the patient still vomited more than 3 hours ago. At 1 hour, and then he would be looking like a fountain of vomit with increasing intensity. So for episodes of vomiting, or episodes like taking in medications, or sudden bouts of, say, yeah, I don't know, something else that is episodic, like a seizure or something like that, which is not status epilepticus, then the annotation should be a single event, like, or a single emoji or a single symbol. So hindi siya continuous line. Kasi ang vomiting, yun, nausea and vomiting, hindi pwedeng tuloy-tuloy siya kasi by the time nakita mo yung pasyente after 4 hours, um, mukha na siyang na-deflate na balloon siguro kung tuloy-tuloy yung pagsusuka niya. So, yun yung sa temporal profile. I know that this is a take-off case, pero I would like na ma-improve ninyo yung inyong paggawa ng temporal profile in such a way that when you look at your temporal profile, automatically, without knowing the history or going through the history, you would have an idea agad of ano yung nangyari sa patient or what happened to the patient. Okay, so sige, let's proceed to the objective data.
So for the physical exam, the patient was drowsy but rousable and not in cardiorespiratory distress. And this altered sensorium may suggest impaired arousal pathways may be due to mast effect, edema, or direct involvement of the thalamus or internal capsule. For the vital signs, the BP is 200/120, and this is consistent with the patient's history of
What?
poor compliance with his antihypertensive medication, and this may represent as a risk factor for a probable hypertensive vascular rupture. The heart rate is 100 beats per minute. The respiratory rate is 22 breaths per minute. The temperature is 37.2 and O2 sat 98%. The HENT, chest, heart, and abdomen and extremities are unremarkable. Next slide, please.
For the neurologic examination, for the general, it is the patient is obtunded, rousable, and able to regard with vigorous tapping, but wakefulness cannot be sustained with only partial eye opening. It is also slow to respond with only 1 to 2 word responses. For the frontal, it is poor concentration and attention. Parietal, no right and left disorientation, no finger agnosia, right-sided neglect on double tactile stimulation. For temporal, oriented to self and person but unable to identify time and place, and able to follow some simple commands. For occipital, able to name some objects showed. Next slide, please. For the cranial nerves, 1, unable to be assessed properly. Cranial nerve 2 and 3, absent right visual threat with right homonymous hemianopsia. Pupils is 3 to 4 millimeters sluggishly reactive to light with intact direct and consensual reflex. For cranial nerve 3, 4, and 6, there's a left-sided preferential gaze but able to cross midline and able to track to the direction of sound when called. For cranial nerve 5, there's an intact bilateral V1 to V3 to all sensory modalities. And cranial nerve 7, there is a right central facial palsy.
For cranial nerve 8, the patient has gross hearing, or it is intact. For 9 and 10, the patient has weak gag reflex, uvula is midline, and the patient is also severely dysarthric. For cranial nerve 11, the patient has good shoulder shrug bilaterally. For 12, tongue is in midline, no fasciculations nor atrophy. For the motor system, the patient is experiencing right-sided hemiplegia, grade 0 strength with flaccid tone. For his sensory system, he has profound loss of sensation to painful stimuli on the right side of the body. For his reflexes, his deep tendon reflexes are 3+ or has brisk response on the right and normal on the left. He also has right Babinski sign and no ankylonus. For meningeal signs, unremarkable, and for cerebellar as well. And in summary, the pertinent positives are patient is 6 years old, male, admitted for TIA in 2021. Patient has poorly controlled hypertension. He also has family history of hypertension, diabetes, and death secondary to myocardial infarction. Patient has dyslipidemia for 12 years. He is also an active smoker. and occasional alcohol drinker. He has sudden severe headache with nausea and vomiting. He also has right-sided weakness, hemi-neglect, hemiplegia, and loss of sensation. He has altered mental status, abducted but rousable, has partial eye opening, and responds with 1 to 2 words only. And his cranial nerve 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 9, and 10 are affected. His pertinent negatives are chest pain, palpitation, dyspnea, and diabetes. He has no history of drug use, not in cardiorespiratory distress. He has no fever, chills, or weight loss, and no lesions in cranial 5, 8, 11, and 12. There are no abnormal findings in reflexes, meninges, and cerebellum. He has no seizures, no loss of consciousness, trauma, and Brudinski sign.
Hello, for the localization part, next slide. Our thought process started with we collated all the pertinent feature that can be a clue for us that it's an upper motor neuron lesion. And we have the hyperreflexia because it's pertinent that the patient have 3 pus in the right bicep, triceps, brachioradialis, patellar, Achilles tendon versus the other side or left that has only 2 pus, which is normal. And we included the right Babinski sign, which is also a hallmark for upper motor neuron lesion, and the right-sided hemiplegia with a score of 0/5 strength with a flaccid tone. And we also observed that the patient have a consistent lobe findings with the frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital. For frontal, the patient have a poor concentration and attention. For parietal, there's a right-sided hemi-neglect with a double tactile stimulation. And for temporal, some parts were normal findings, but the patient is unable to identify time and place, but able to follow some simple commands. With occipital, the patient was able to name some objects shown. So it's like a clue for us that maybe we're dealing with an intracerebral lesion, but first we have to know the laterality. So for our second thought process, we need to collate some major clues that can serve as context to contextualize where is the laterality. So we put here, although it's not the complete list yet. So we have the right-sided hemiplegia. So for us, it's kind of like saying there's a left cortical spinal tract involvement, profound right-sided sensory loss, which can be a clue that there's a left sensory pathway involvement, and a right homonymous hemianopia, which can also be a clue that there's a left optic gradation or the optic fibers involved, and the left preferential gaze, which can also be a clue that there's a left frontal eye field because there's a collated constellation of symptoms that there's a motor deficit, sensory deficit, and visual manifestation. And then for the next upcoming slide, we lay out all the tracks involved to have a commonality or the clue, to serve as a clue where the commonality of the areas involved. So next slide, please.
So the patient presents with right central facial palsy and severely dysarthritic weak right gag reflex. So for the pathway affected, it will be the corticobulbar tract. For the right central facial palsy, the corticobulbar tract, which is the motor pathway to the face and the head, it runs alongside the corticospinal tract in the internal capsule, and if there's a lesion here, it interrupts the signals to the lower right face, causing a central facial palsy. The patient's forehead is spared because it has bilateral innervation. While for the dysarthritic and weak right gag reflex, it's also from the damage to the corticobulbar tract, where the cranial nerves 9, 10, and 12 are affected, and these nerves supply the larynx, the pharynx, and the tongue. So if there is an affectation, it results to difficulty in articulating and swallowing. Next slide, please. So for the right hemiplegia and also for the right Babinski sign, it's due to affectation of the corticospinal tract, which means motor control here is affected. So there's an affectation in the motor pathway, so the patient presents with weakness. Also, for the right Babinski sign, it's a hallmark for upper motor neuron lesion, which also confirms that there's a damage to the corticospinal tract. Next slide, please.
And in terms of the sensory deficit, so the patient have the profound sensory loss on the right, but it was noted on the given case that the patient's loss of sensory is especially observed when painful stimulus was applied. So we uh put here the lateral spinothalamic tract. So it's like sensory information such as the pain is carried by the spinothalamic tract, ascends through the internal capsule and then to the primary somatosensory cortex. So if we are suspecting the involvement of internal capsule also, this will interrupt the sensory input from the right side of the body, which can explain the sensory loss on the right, especially the reported pain sensation loss on the right side, which is specific for the lateral spinothalamic tract. But we can also assess if the patient also had other sensory loss, is the touch, vibration, pressure, those things. But the only stated or highlighted was the in terms of the painful stimuli. Next is the right homonymous hemianopia. So if you're suspecting a left optic radiation fibers involvement, this can indicate an interruption of the visual pathway after the optic chiasm. So you can see here the number 4 in the example picture. The visual information from the right visual field for both eyes can travel through the left optic radiation, which passes near the basal ganglia and internal capsule, and then down to the occipital lobe. So the hemorrhage and the surrounding edema might have compressed or damaged these fibers, which shows this manifestation. So with the motor deficit, sensory deficit, and this visual manifestation, we can have the clue that the lesion simultaneously affect the descending motor and ascending sensory tracts, which can also consolidate the involvement of the internal capsule. Next slide.
So for the visual manifestation, the patient presented with a left-sided preferential gaze, where the patient was able to cross the midline and able to track to direction of San fold. Wherein for left-sided preferential gaze, a stroke causes a same-sided or ipsilational preferential gaze when it occurs in the cerebral hemisphere, while an ipsilational gaze palsy or inability to look on the same side when it occurs in the pons, where in the case of our patient, the patient is able to look at the same side of the possible lesion or your left-sided preferential gaze. Wherein the mechanism for this is that the frontal eye field in one hemisphere typically drives voluntary eye movement to the opposite or contralateral side, wherein a destructive stroke lesion damages the FEF on one side. For example, in this case, a lesion on the left causes the right side unopposed. For the next symptoms would be your mental status, temporal lobe, and frontal lobe. The patient presented with a sudden onset of severe headache, altered mental status, and obtunded, which is caused by mass effect and compression, wherein a large intracerebral hemorrhage caused a rapid increase in intracranial pressure, where the mass effect from the blood and surrounding edema compresses deep brain structures, including the reticular activating system, leading to altered consciousness and global brain dysfunction, which present clinically as headache, nausea, and vomiting. The mass effect is caused by the hematoma from the bleeding, which would create a compression on brain structure that would cause neuronal dysfunction, leading to possible manifestation of various focal deficits, depending on the areas of the lesion. Lastly, the patient also presented with poor concentration, attention, and unable to identify time and place. The temporal and frontal lobe are affected due to the mass effect resulting in the following neurological deficit. This indicates the disruption of higher order cognitive function, a larger lesion in the dominant left hemisphere, especially with the involvement of adjacent temporal and frontal lobe structures, In addition, the presence of right-sided hemineglect also indicates the involvement of parietal lobe. Next slide, please.
So to summarize, based on the neurological findings of the right-sided hemiplegia with flaccid tone, so that would indicate damage to the left primary motor cortex or the left internal capsule. For the right Babinski sign, it indicates an upper motor neuron lesion in the left corticospinal tract. For the weak gag reflex and severely dysarthric, it's due to affectations in the left corticobulbar fibers. For the right central facial palsy, it's due to the damage in the left corticobulbar tract in the cerebral hemisphere. The profound loss of sensation on the right side of the body is due to the damage in the left primary somatosensory cortex or the left internal capsule. For the right homonymous hemianopia, it's the damage to the left optic radiation. And for the left-sided preferential gaze, it suggests a lesion in the left frontal eye field. And for the obtunded slow response and ability to follow simple commands, it indicates an altered mental status and which is common in large deep hemisphere lesions. So for the localization, it is in the left cerebral hemisphere, specifically involving the left basal ganglia, internal capsule, and adjacent structures.
So with that, our primary clinical impression is an acute hemorrhagic stroke, specifically an intracerebral hemorrhage or ICH. This diagnosis is strongly supported by the classic presentation of a sudden onset severe headache, or also called a thunderclap headache associated with nausea and vomiting, which is highly characteristic of acute bleeding and elevated intracranial pressure. The patient rapidly progressed to an obtunded state with severe focal neurological deficits within 4 hours, including right-sided hemiplegia, right homonymous hemianopia, and left-sided preferential gaze, all indicating a large, rapidly expanding lesion compressing the left cerebral parenchyma. Next slide, please. The underlying etiology is most likely hypertensive angiopathy, given his 18-year history of poorly compliant hypertension. This chronic hypertension damages the small penetrating arteries, leading to the formation of Charcot-Bouchard microaneurysms. The acute hypertensive crisis caused one of these weakened vessels to rupture, resulting in the extravasation of blood and formation of a hematoma. Next slide.
So for the risk factors, the patient has controlled hypertension for 18 years, which caused chronic injury to small penetrating arteries, especially the lenticulostriate arteries supplying the basal ganglia. Over time, these vessels develop lipohyalinosis and microaneurysm formation, predisposing them to rupture during a sudden blood pressure surge. His dyslipidemia and poor statin compliance promoted arteriosclerosis and endothelial dysfunction, further weakening the vessel walls. Lifestyle factors, including a 23-pack year, smoking history, and occasional alcohol intake, contributed to oxidative stress, transient BP, spikes, and vascular damage. Age and male sex added non-modifiable risks, while a positive family history of hypertension, diabetes, and myocardial infarction indicates genetic susceptibility to vascular disease. Altogether, these factors led to chronic vessel degeneration and culminated in the rupture of a lenticulostriate artery, producing a left basal ganglia hemorrhage manifesting as right hemiplegia, sensory loss, and altered sensorium. Next slide, please.
Moving on to diagnostics, the first test we would like to do for this patient is a hematology panel. So this was ordered to
rule out hematologic or coagulopathic causes of bleeding, and also to assess for infection or anemia and establish baseline values for ongoing monitoring. So as provided, results of the patients show a hemoglobin of 14.2 grams per deciliter and hematocrit of 42 within normal limits, indicating no anemia, blood loss. The white blood cell count is 7.1 times 10 to the 9 per liters, which is normal. However, the differential shows a mild lymphocytosis at 43% compared to the normal range of 20 to 40. So this slight increase may represent a stress response to the acute intracerebral hemorrhage rather than an infectious process, as the patient is febrile and shows no clinical signs of infection. So the eosinophils, basophils, and stubs are within normal limits. The platelet count is 377 times 10 to the 9 per liters, also within normal limits, ruling out thrombocytopenia or platelet dysfunction as a cause of bleeding. Coagulation studies show a prothrombin time of 12 seconds, INR of 1, and PTT of 27 seconds, which all within normal limits, indicating that both the intrinsic and extrinsic coagulation pathways are intact. So overall, these findings support a hypertensive rather than hematologic etiology for the intracerebral hemorrhage. Next slide.
So for the metabolic panel, the patient's HbA1c is 12.4%, which the normal range is from 4 to 6%, so it is elevated. And the fasting glucose is 231, which is supposedly should be less than or equal to 126. So it is also elevated. So this basically means that initially, the patient denied history of diabetes mellitus 2. However, based on these results, he belongs under the category of diabetes. So he needs to get this checked and take the necessary medications and lifestyle modifications, as this comorbidity puts him at risk for cardiovascular diseases and increases the risk for stroke. Next, for total cholesterol, it is within normal range. Ideally, it should be less than 200. LDL is elevated. It should be less than 100. HDL is 59, which is within normal range, ideally more than 40 for males. The patient's triglycerides is 152, which is elevated, as the normal range is less than 150. So with this, his per compliance with his dyslipidemia medications are reflected in his lipid profile. Despite having been diagnosed and prescribed with the medications for 12 years, LDL and triglycerides are still high. So this can lead to the narrowing of the arteries due to accumulation of plaque from either healthy diet or even his smoking and alcohol drinking. Hence, similar with this diabetes, lifestyle modifications are necessary, as this puts him at risk for cardiovascular diseases and increases the risk for stroke. Next slide, please. So this of the patient's head. So CT scans are usually used to check for bleeds, mass effect, or hydrocephalus in the brain. So looking at this radiograph, the left side of the brain has an apparent hyperdense area that's covering the entirety of the basal ganglia. So this shows a hemorrhage since blood appears white or hyperdense in CT scans. And if you notice directly surrounding the white area is a gray outline, which is the edema. With these two combined, there is a mass effect whereby the soft tissues of the brain are displaced due to the increased cranial pressure caused by the bleed and edema. Considering that the patient has uncontrolled hypertension of 18 years, as well as the location of the hemorrhage, which is in the basal ganglia, this points to a case of hypertensive intracerebral hemorrhage, supporting the primary impression.
Okay, so other than the diagnostic, even following our additional tests we would like to do for this patient. So first is CT angiogram of the head and neck. Compared to non-contrast CT angiogram uses iodinated contrast visualized vessels. So this may be used to evaluate intracranial and extracranial blood vessels, to rule out aneurysms, arteriovenous malformations, or vascular stenosis. The next is MRI of the brain. This provides a greater anatomic detail of the brain parenchyma and surrounding structures. For this case, it can be used to evaluate the extent of secondary brain injury, perilesional edema, and ventricular compression from mass effect. Next slide, please. Sorry, back. Okay, next is cardiac-specific troponin. So this test helps detect any myocardial injury that may occur either from an acute coronary syndrome or from a neurogenic cardiac injury due to a catecholamine surge during a stroke. For patient JA, this is especially relevant because of his history of dyslipidemia, hypertension, and family history of myocardial infarction. Okay, next slide. Okay, next is ECG. And ECG is done to check for arrhythmias, ischemic changes, or signs of left ventricular hypertrophy that may result from long-standing hypertension. Since patient JA's comorbidities increase his risk for LVH and arrhythmias, these can compromise cerebral perfusion and worsen stroke outcomes. So having a baseline ECG is therefore essential in acute stroke care where continuous cardiac rhythm monitoring is needed. The next is chest X-ray. So another baseline test is chest X-ray, which is used to evaluate cardiomegaly, pulmonary congestion, or aortic changes. These findings help the extent of cardiac strain from hypertension and guide fluid and blood pressure management during recovery. Then lastly is urinalysis. And this is to check for proteinuria or hematuria, which could signify kidney involvement in the form of chronic hypertensive nephropathy. So confirming kidney involvement would influence his fluid management, drug choice, and prognosis. So that's all for diagnostic.
Next slide, please. So for the first differential, we have subarachnoid hemorrhage, which is defined as the accumulation of blood in the space between the arachnoid membrane and the pia mater around the brain. So subarachnoid hemorrhage is ruled in this case because of the patient's chief complaint, which is sudden severely painful headache, right-sided weakness, and altered mental status. There are also associated symptoms that came with the headache, which is nausea and vomiting. Patient also has uncontrolled hypertension with BP of 120, and the patient has poor compliance with his medications. With regards to the patient's social history, patient has a 23-pack-year smoking history and also has alcohol history. However, subarachnoid hemorrhage is ruled out because of negative signs of meningeal irritation as seen by the negative Koenigs and Brzezinski sign. There's also negative diplopia and negative photophobia. The patient also does not present, and the patient has no history of convulsive seizures, no loss of consciousness, and also the results of the non-contrast CT scan of the head is consistent with a hypertensive intracerebral hemorrhage.
So another differential that should be made in the case of an intracerebral hemorrhage is ischemic stroke, because this is always a differential that should be considered prior to the CT scan and other ancillary diagnostic results, as the acute hemorrhagic stroke and ischemic stroke must be distinguished in order to determine proper treatment. The then onset of focal symptoms are more suggestive of an occlusive embolus rather than stenosis, and the manifesting symptoms are similar to a left middle cerebral artery stem or M1 occlusion syndrome. The basis of ruling this in is in the saltatory progression of the neurological deficits, specifically the right-sided neurological deficits. Hemiplegia, of the face, arm, and leg can be expected. This can be due to the infarction of the posterior limb of the internal capsule, and manifestations are contralateral to the occlusion. The same goes with hemianesthesia. Right homonymous hemianopia can also be expected because of the possible infarction of the lateral geniculate body, manifestations are also collateral to the occlusion. The preferential gaze is also an expected manifestation, and the deviation of the gaze is toward the laterality of the lesion. So these are all in line with the patient's current condition. There's also a presence of aphasia, which can have varying manifestations in M1 occlusion syndrome. And this is specific for the left side as well. And another expected symptom is the presence of an altered mental status, particularly for the patient, he was obtunded. This isn't actually part of the M1 occlusion syndrome in particular, but is a part of an ischemic stroke as a whole. And lastly, not really lastly, another important consideration to make is the persistence of the neurological deficits, which is more than 4 hours, because this could be transient ischemia if it had lasted for less than an hour. But for the patient, there had been no signs of resolution of the symptoms even 4 hours after the onset. There was also the history of vascular risk factors, which include the hypertension, poorly controlled diabetes, and dyslipidemia, smoking, among others. So the reason we rule this out is primarily because of the sudden onset severe headache alongside the nausea and vomiting. These are leaning more toward an intracranial hemorrhage because the increase in intracranial pressure really causes this. And most importantly, this can be definitively ruled out after the provision of the computed tomography scan showing positive signs for hemorrhage. Next slide, please.
Doc, sorry. How about the pressure? Could we differentiate a possible intracerebral hematoma versus that of an infarct or versus an ischemic stroke with the blood pressure?
For the blood pressure, actually, I forgot to mention that it can't be differentiated completely with just blood pressure alone, because in both cases, the body is attempting to supply blood or perfuse the brain, and in both cases, there is this reduced perfusion to the brain due to the lesion. So hypertension more than the normal baseline of the patient is going to be expected for both cases.
But for majority, if we're going to look at the majority of cases, it is true that sometimes ischemic stroke can present with hypertension. But usually, the more extreme hypertensive or extreme blood pressure or the higher blood pressure would be seen in intracerebral hematomas rather than ischemic strokes. Because primarily, your intracerebral hematomas, especially the large ones, would present with an increased intracranial pressure. And due to that, your body would tend to increase the blood pressure to maintain the perfusion for the entirety of the brain, or at least one hemisphere. For infarcts or for ischemic stroke, they don't usually present with intracranial hypertension or increased intracranial pressure at the start. Actually, with the onset of ischemia, you would actually have lower intracranial pressure at the start because there would be decrease in the blood flow. And if we would take that, or we would relate that to the Monroe-Kelly doctrine, there would be a decrease in the amount or in the volume of blood because of the ischemic stroke. Thus, it would not really increase the volume, but rather, or the pressure, but rather possibly decrease it. So, yun. Commonly, pag nakita kayo ng patient sa ER, and you would see that the patient would have a very high blood pressure, like 190 or 200, you would think of an intracerebral hematoma first rather than an ischemic stroke. Yun. So, proceed.
Our third differential is hypertensive encephalopathy. This is a rapidly evolving syndrome that presents with severe hypertension, where systolic blood pressure usually reaches above 195 millimeters of mercury. Headache, nausea and vomiting, visual disturbances, confusion, and may even progress to stupor and coma in severe cases. This is ruled in for our patient as he has uncontrolled hypertension with BP of 200 over 120 mmHg, headache, nausea and vomiting, and an altered mental status. However, we ruled this out as the patient did not have seizures, papilledema, or retinal hemorrhages. Furthermore, he presented with right-sided weakness, which is uncommon for hypertensive encephalopathy, as this usually pertains to symptoms of the occipital and parietal regions. Looking at the patient CT scan, he does not have the fairly symmetrical abnormal hyperintensity in the parieto-occipital lobes, which is also more common with hypertensive encephalopathy. Next slide, please.
So our final diagnosis, we have acute hemorrhagic stroke, left basal ganglia hypertensive, intracerebral hemorrhage, secondary to chronic uncontrolled hypertension involving the lenticulostriate arteries, which are deep penetrating branches of the MCA, with a National Institute of Health stroke scale score of 24, indicating a severe stroke. So indicated below are the pertinent laboratory CT scan results and our scoring to the patient's manifestations. Next slide, please.
Next, we move on to the management plan for the patient. This includes the medical, surgical, and non-pharmacological management. Next slide, please. For the medical management, the immediate aim is to minimize the risk of hematoma expansion within the first 24 to 72 hours. Of course, we need to follow the ABC, the airway, breathing, and circulatory support. And we have to stabilize the vital signs of the patient and most importantly, lowering of the blood pressure of the patient, which is 200 over 120 mmHg. According to the American Stroke Guidelines, it is recommended that reducing blood pressure in SBP of less than 140 to 180 mmHg in those with SBP ranging between 150 to 220 mmHg. This is because that if you lower the blood pressure too quickly or too much, cerebral perfusion pressure can fall abruptly and may lead to worse outcomes, including ischemic penumbra. For pharmacological, nicardipine IV drip 2.5 to 15 mg per hour is one of the first line due to its titrability, but labetalol or hydralazine IV may be used as an alternative if it's not available. We should take the blood pressure every 15 minutes and maintain its normal BP for 24 to 48 hours. Start CBG, fluid and electrolyte management, and blood glucose measurement, while aiming for normal glycemia with strict avoidance of hypoglycemia is also indicated. For the altered sensorium of our patient, for the ICP management, elevated head of bed to 30 degrees and put the neck in neutral position while avoiding Valsalva, coughing, and abdominal straining. And we can also administer mannitol or hypertonic saline since there is again signs of increased cranial pressure presenting as an altered mental status. For the maintenance of the patient, we want to also repeat CT to see if the patient is getting better. Next slide, please.
Let's remember that surgery does not benefit all patients with intracerebral hemorrhage. So, to evaluate whether the patient will benefit from surgery, it is important to consider five different factors, namely location, size, neurologic status, general medical condition, and the timing of the surgery. So, first, we evaluate the location. The CT scan shows a left basal ganglia hemorrhage, which involves deep supratentorial structures. These deep-seated hemorrhages are less surgically accessible compared to lobar or cerebellar bleeds. Because critical motor and sensory tracts pass through the basal ganglia and internal capsule, surgical evacuation in this area carries a high risk of further neurologic injury and offers little improvement in functional outcome. Therefore, patient use against surgical evacuation in this patient. Next, you evaluate the size. So there is a large left-sided basal ganglia hemorrhage with significant mass effect and surrounding edema, likely exceeding 30 ml in volume. So according to the current AHA guidelines, for supratentorial ICH volumes greater than 20 to 30 ml in patients with moderate GCS scores 5 to 12, minimally invasive hematoma evacuation may be considered to improve functional outcomes, but only if the hematoma is accessible. But in this case, since the bleed is deep, even a large volume does not automatically justify surgery, especially when the patient's clinical status is relatively stable. Next slide, please. So now we evaluate the neurologic status upon presentation. So clinically, the patient is drowsy but rousable with sluggishly reactive pupils, no abnormal respiratory pattern, and no signs of herniation. This means that the midbrain pons and medulla are still intact. There is mass effect, but there is no brainstem compression. So surgical intervention generally has the greatest value in patients with rapid neurologic deterioration within hours, such as falling GC or removing suspension. Is currently neurologically stable, is not yet indicated, and close monitoring with repeat imaging is preferred. So next is the general medical condition. The patient is a 60-year-old male in a hypertensive crisis with multiple comorbidities. So evidence shows that surgically treated patients younger than 60 years have better survival outcomes, while those above 60 have up to 65% mortality rate, largely due to the reduced brain plasticity and impaired microglial recovery. In addition, his poorly controlled hypertension and metabolic conditions increase perioperative risks as hematoma expansion and poor wound healing. Therefore, the priority should be to stabilize blood pressure, optimize the glucose levels, and control the ICP before any surgical consideration. And next slide. Lastly, we have the timing of the surgery. So the patient presented around 4 hours after his onset. So while some studies show that surgery within 13 hours can improve the mortality rates, this is only beneficial when the hematoma is surgically accessible and when the patient shows clinical deterioration. Since our patient remains hemodynamically and neurologically stable, early surgery is not indicated at this time. Instead, ongoing medical management and close observation are the appropriate steps. And surgery is only reserved if neurologic worsening or herniation occurs. So therefore, in this patient, surgery is not warranted at this stage. And the mainstay of the management should be aggressive medical therapy, ICP and BP control, and serial neurologic monitoring. The decompression or minimally invasive hematoma evacuation may be done only for patients with superficial hematoma in cerebral white matter that causes mass effect and herniation, while ventricular drainage with or without intraventricular thrombolysis may be required in patients with IVH and acute hydrocephalus. Next slide.
So next we have the
I'm sorry. Before we go to the non-pharmacological management, I would like to clarify lang yung sa may surgical management first, which is actually yun yung lecture natin. No, initially, yun yung binagbasihan nito. Okay, can we go back? 2 slides back. Yan. Okay, that's it. Okay, so it is true that actually I placed in the lecture that not all hematomas need to be operated on. Not all intracerebral hematomas need to be operated on because some of the patients would improve or would survive the surgery actually without, or would survive the intracerebral hematoma without surgery. Also, some of them would die even if without surgery, or even if with surgery rather. So for the location, I think I have to clarify that not because you have a deep lesion that surgery would be contraindicated. So that's why everything should be considered altogether. All those factors should be considered altogether and not individually. Because if we're going to look at it individually, and then most probably the patient would not benefit, or rather would not have an ideal management of the patient's disease. For location, we usually do surgery for basal ganglia lesions. For here nakalagay kasi deep supratentorial structures are less surgically accessible compared to lower cerebellar and brainstem hemorrhages. Brainstem hemorrhages are often not operated on. Primarily, one, it's very deep. It's in the center of the cranium almost. So you don't really do brainstem hemorrhages. Number two, the brainstem is so small. So when you have an intracerebral, or if you have a brainstem hemorrhage or a brainstem hematoma, and you remove that hematoma, there's a tendency that you would be removing a chunk of the brainstem, if not a whole part of the brainstem. So dito, yung nakalagay kasi na para baka lang magkaroon tayo ng impression that we do surgery on brainstem hemorrhages. We usually don't. No? Kasi usually maliliit lang yan kung buhay pa yung patient. Pero kung pangit na yung lagay nung patient, ibig sabihin nun, malaki yung hematoma. And if malaki yung hematoma, if you remove it, then you would be removing the brainstem natin. So, I was saying that everything should be considered. Here, for the location, the patient's location is in the basal ganglia. And if I think I mentioned it in the lecture, that you can actually access the basal ganglia by going through the Sylvian fissure and going through the insula. If you're going to look at your anatomy, right after the insula, you actually have the basal ganglia na agad. So, it is really not that deep. So, hindi siya ganun kalalim. Now, for the size, confirm ko lang ano nga yung size ng hematoma na to. I don't know if nabanggit. Anyone? Meron bang nakalagay?
Parang large lang po yung sabi sa
Large
CT scan.
Okay. So, it's a fairly large hematoma. Roughly looking at it by kasi isang slide lang yung isang cut lang yung binigay eh. Ideally sana you would be able to see everything kasi at least you could compute for the size, no? Yung Kotari method. It's an important method to compute for the volume of the hematoma. It can be very useful for you. So, given nung ganung klase ng hematoma, siguro roughly mga nasa 6 or less. Siguro mga nasa 50. Something like that. 50 cc na hematoma. If we're just going to leave that hematoma there, we know that in sa earlier slides ng lecture, you would see that the hematoma would cause compression, would cause edema, and everything about the hematoma would cause edema. If we're just going to leave it there, given that size, then even with all the medical management we could possibly do, there's a high there's a high likelihood that the patient would not survive. So, yun lang. So, location, size, yun pa lang siya yung pinag-iisipan natin. Hindi kasi siya ganun parang algorithm lang na ganito, yes, no, yes, no. Especially, yung pino-point out ko din during the latter part of the section on intracerebral hematoma, yung other logistics like the family support is important kasi especially in this case na left-sided siya. So a lot of the previous functions of the patient might not be recovered. And then so yun, susunod na slide dito. Yan. Neurological status. So ano balik kung if we're going to give a universal, parang if we're going to use the universal language or rather way to measure or relate the consciousness of the patient, anong lalabas na GCS niya? So, obtunded siya. Ang ibig sabihin is that eye-opening to verbal. Meron ba? Tapos dito, i-clarify ko lang din. Kasi nakalagay, findings in the patient, no signs of herniation. So, siguro we have to also assess what is herniation. So, sabihin natin siguro dito, no herniation syndrome. Something like that. Siguro, yung ibig sabihin dito. Kasi if you're going to look at the CT scan, you're going to see the left side of the brain encroaching into the right side of the brain. And in essence, that is the description of herniation. Diba? Contents of one compartment going into the other compartment. So in this case, even if wala siyang signs of herniation, or kung wala ba talaga, no, the imaging of the patient would show you that there is remarkable herniation. Hindi lang siya, kadalasan, hindi lang yung rapid neurologic deterioration yung reason for the surgery. As mentioned also in the lecture or the earlier part of the lecture, an important factor would be the intracranial pressure. If we're going to do surgery or do intervention at the time that the patient is herniating, and then there's a big chance that we're going to be late in managing the patient. Because when we see that the patient would be herniating na, or rather, if we see that the patient is herniating na, and then at that time, tsaka pa lang tayo tsaka pa lang tayo gagawa ng intervention, we know that it would take time before we could do surgery dun sa patient. No? So, hindi agad-agad na mapapasok natin sa OR, mabubuksan natin, may evacuate natin yung hematoma. Usually, it would take around, the fastest siguro would be around 30 minutes to 1 hour. And during that time, the damage to the brain would have been ongoing. No? So, tuloy-tuloy yung damage sa brain noon. So, maaring by the time mapasok natin, hindi na natin siya mababawi. Because once the patient herniates, there would be an accompanying compromise to the blood flow to that part of the brain or to the brain itself, or to the entirety of the brain itself. Given that, you have mere minutes na lang to have or to make the damages or the compromise reversible. So for surgeries, we do not wait for herniation to do surgery. If there is a chance or a big chance that the patient would be herniating or could herniate, and then the surgery would be done even if the patient is not herniated yet. And more than herniation, the intracranial pressure would be a more weight, or would rather have more weight in deciding whether to do surgery or not. So yun. So dito, yung intracranial pressure pa din. So sabi ko nga dun earlier sa lecture, a lot of the things that we do in neurosurgery would involve managing the intracranial pressure and not actually managing herniation kasi. Kasi herniation, ibig sabihin nun, you're late na. No? So, hindi natin manage pag nag-herniate na. Minamanage natin kung mataas yung intracranial pressure and we want to decrease it, and also kung alam natin na eventually or may high likelihood na tataas yung ICP niya. So, and to know that, para lang to add to the complexity of deciding whether to operate or not, dahil para alam natin kung tataas yung intracranial pressure, we have to know the natural history of the disease. No? Importanteng factor, syempre, na alam natin yung natural history ng sakit. Like, in particular, for intracerebral hematomas, I think I placed earlier dun sa mga slides that hindi lang yung hematoma per se yung problem. Hindi lang yung mass effect brought about by the hematoma yung problem. So, there are a lot of factors which would cause further deterioration or cause further damage to the brain with intracerebral hematomas. And we should know that. And we should, kumbaga, preempt kung ano man yung pwedeng mangyari. And we should be ready for that. So, isa yon sa mga tinitingnan na kung surgical or not. Also, in the section of cerebellar bleeds, no, I mentioned there, though this is a cerebral, not a cerebellar bleed, but I mentioned sa cerebellar bleeds that a purely cerebellar lesion is not supposed to decrease the patient's sensorium, no, unless there's compression to the brainstem. For supratentorial lesions as well, not all supratentorial lesions should decrease the sensorium of the patient. If the structures which regulate the wakefulness of the patients are not affected, then you shouldn't expect a decrease in sensorium. So, kung meron kang decrease in sensorium in a patient that you do not expect to have decrease in sensorium because of the location of the lesion, and then probably the one causing the decrease in sensorium would be the intracranial pressure, or that would be the increase in intracranial pressure. Okay? Yan. So, dito, I also said, actually, kung if you read the annotation for general medical condition, if you read the annotation or you listen to the annotation, I also said that I believe that age is just a number. No, we can see patients who are 70 years older, meron pa nga mga 90 plus joining triathlon. So, we cannot condemn patients greater than 60 years old. No, pagpalo niya ng 60 years old, wag na natin operahan. No, wawa naman sila kasi pwede pa silang mag-triathlete eh. 'Di ba? Depende lagi doon sa pre-morbid condition. Kaya general medical condition lang yan eh. Hindi talaga tayo ganun ka-strict when it comes to age. It always depends on the pre-morbid condition. It is true that patients older or a more advanced age would have more comorbidities than those that are in the lower age or in the younger age group. Pero some patients in the older age group got to that old age group because they lead healthy lifestyles. No? Though this patient obviously did not. Pero hindi lahat yon. So hindi natin pwedeng lahatin na pag age 60, pwede na natin sabihin, pangit na po, hindi na po natin na-operahan kasi 60 na siya. So, isa din yon sa gusto nating ma-impart na gusto ko na makita ninyo na hindi siya algorithm managing or deciding whether surgery would benefit the patient or not is not an algorithm. It is something that should be decided by analyzing each and every of those 5 factors individually and together. No, analyze them na sama-sama sila, hindi lang siya talaga na isa-isa. Yung susunod na slide dito, timing. Okay. Timing, may binanggit tayo na improve mortality rates. No? So dito, if we're going to prolong yung timing ng surgery, if we're going to do the surgery late, no? Or kasi parang dito, sabi is, although surgery within 13 hours may improve mortality rates, surgery is only suggested if the hematoma is accessible and there is significant deterioration. So dito, nandun na naman, we're looking at the case again na parang hindi tayo pwedeng mali. Na yung parang the situation of the patient is static, no? Na hindi dynamic yung sakit. Na hindi siya nag-change. If we know the natural history nga of the intracerebral hematoma, we know that edema would ensue. We know that the edema would worsen. No? We know that ICP would increase further. And knowing that the mortality rates would improve if you do it within 13 hours, then it would be wrong not to do the surgery and help the patient who presented at the hospital's emergency room at 4 hours post-ictus. Diba? So parang ando na siya nung 4 hours and then alam natin na i-improve yung mortality rate niya if we do the surgery within 13 hours pero hindi na lang natin gagawin yung surgery. So parang ang mangyayari kasi doon, we are just condemning the patient to die, ganun. So very tricky. Yung gusto ko din makita nyo, very tricky yung pag-decide whether to do surgery or not. Pero hindi rin siya ganun ka-tricky kasi all we have to do is actually understand each of those factors and then factor them all together. for us to decide whether to do surgery or not. For this patient, surgery would be warranted. No? Surgery would be warranted for this patient. Kasi, yun, as mentioned yung mga factors kanina, for the location, there's an option or there is an approach wherein you would not compromise a lot of brain. You can go through the insula. So, it is accessible. For the size, though wala namang sinabi na size, sizable yung mass pero hindi siya ganun kalaki. That would increase the mortality rate even if you do surgery. Pagdating sa neurologic status ng patient, gising pa siya. Kung ito, GCS3 na, GCS4 na, given the size of the hematoma, and then probably we would tend to go through the non-surgical route. Non-surgical route, hindi ibig sabihin na hindi na natin operahan, gagaling na siya nung walang operasyon. No. It means that we're going through the non-surgical route because even surgery may not be able to help. So it would be an exercise in futility. And the patient would die. So yun lang siya, kaya hindi siya operahan kung sobrang decrease in sensorium. Yun. Ano pa nga yun? So yun, general medical condition, 60 pa lang siya. Sa ngayon kasi, 60 is the new 40 na daw eh. Nagbabago na eh. Hindi na kamukha dati na pag 60 ka, sobrang weak ka na o sobrang senior citizen ka na talaga yung dating mo. Though senior citizen na talaga yung by classification, pero most of the 60 years old ngayon, hindi mo makikita na kamukha ng 60 years old dati. And of course, yun nga, yung sa timing. So, yun lang yung gusto ko impart. Kasi ito yung, kaya dito ako mas madami yung kinument kasi ito yung lecture actually. So, ito yung gusto ko na pagdating sa intracerebral hematomas, ito yung kailangan ninyong malaman. So, may questions kayo pagdating dito? Wala. Kung walang question, isa din important thing that you should understand or you should know is that surgery is not the only or it's not the treatment or the only treatment needed for hemorrhagic strokes. Surgery is actually the initial, no? Or could be, hindi kasi syempre meron ka nung medical initially pala. Pero once mag-deteriorate or hindi na kaya ng medical management, surgery na yung start ng management. Ibig sabihin, hindi pwedeng surgery lang. Hindi pwedeng after we do surgery, we would think that the patient would be going home well, no, without any other things that we have to do. Surgery would be there just to decrease the intracranial pressure. Surgery will not repair anything. It will not repair the brain parenchyma. It would only decrease the intracranial pressure to give way for the brain's natural healing ability, no, or yung neuroplasticity. And also, yun, surgery is there to decrease the ICP to help or probably help the damage being caused by the hemorrhage. So, yun lang siya. No? Hindi siya yung end. Kaya, yung susunod na, kumbaga, after the surgery, how you manage the patient would also have a big impact on the survivability ng pasyente. Okay? So, yun. So, sige, proceed na.
So moving forward, we proceed to the next aspect of care,
the non-pharmacological management. So during the hospital stay, the patient is advised to be on strict bed rest with the head of the bed elevated to 30 degrees. This is done to minimize physical exertion, which can increase the blood pressure and to promote venous drainage from the brain via the jugular veins, thereby helping reduce intracranial pressure. Next, strict intake and output monitoring is also important because fluid overload can increase the ICP, while dehydration can reduce cerebral perfusion and can cause ischemia. Monitoring is particularly crucial if mannitol is administered, as it promotes diuresis and can lead to dehydration and electrolyte imbalances if not closely observed. Aspiration precautions will also be implemented. The patient will be kept NPO until a swallowing assessment is completed. As in stroke, especially with dysarthria and weak gag reflex, patients often have impaired swallowing. So if swallowing is unsafe, nasogastric feeding will be initiated to ensure adequate and nutritional support. Once the patient is stable and cleared by the attending physician, a referral will be made to rehabilitation department. So physical therapy will focus on restoring motor function, while occupational therapy will assist in regaining independence and activities of daily living. So exercise and weight management are recommended once the patient has regained his strength. This will help improve lipid profiles and maintain a healthy weight. Next slide, please. So, for patient education, emphasize blood pressure and glucose monitoring and the importance of adherence to prescribed medication. Finally, regular follow-up is essential to monitor the patient's recovery and detect any complications early. Follow-up visits also play a key role in preventing stroke recurrence by reinforcing adherence to prescribed medication and recommended lifestyle modification. Lastly, providing continuous education and emotional support is important, not only for the patient but also for the family, as a strong support system greatly improves the patient's prognosis and overall quality of life. Next slide, please. That's all. Thank you for listening.
Okay, so thank you for the presentation, and yung isa lang din regarding the subsequent management of intracerebral hematoma. Primarily, if we're going to, or rather, if we're going to simplify the management of intracerebral hematomas or any stroke for that matter, the first thing that we do, or the first management that we do for the patient would be stabilizing the stroke. Stabilizing the patient or stabilizing the stroke. As we know, if we just leave the blood alone, or there are times when we just leave alone, or even we leave the infarct alone without doing anything, without medical management or surgical management, we know that the mortality rate is quite high. So we have to stabilize the stroke first. Then what comes after stabilization of the stroke would be prevention and rehabilitation. No? In a nutshell, yun yung management lang ng stroke actually. Stabilize the stroke, then prevent it from happening again, and then rehabilitate the patient so that the patient could return near to normal as possible. We cannot usually in strokes, or for some strokes, especially for intracerebral hematomas and infarcts, most of the time we cannot return them to normal, or return the functions or each function of the patient to normal. But what we can do is return it as near to normal as possible. So para hindi mahirap na isipin yung management ng stroke, tatlo lang yun. Basically, tatlo lang. Siyempre, di natin sinasama yung prevention. Prevention would come beforehand pa talaga. Pero first, we stabilize the stroke, and then we prevent it from happening again, and then we rehabilitate. So, yun lang. So, may questions po ba kayo?
Noon naman po to.
Alright, so if you have no more questions, yeah, so thank you and good luck sa exams.
Thank you, Doc.
Thank you po,
Thank you,
Doc.
Doc.